Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my lecture on the subject Classical and Modern Literature. Today, on our 12th lecture, we will have a general information about realism and naturalism direction on American literature. You'll have a general information about Mark Twain and his work The Adventure of Tom Sawyer. You'll investigate the characters of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and you'll get a general information about Theodore Dreiser's biography and his work Sister Carrie. Also, you'll have a general information about John Steinbeck's work Grapes of Wrath, and you will have a general short information about Grapes of Wrath, and we will analyze the plot of the Grapes of Wrath.
We've all heard the phrase get real at one time or another, usually when someone thinks we're being childish or living in a fantasy land. In American literature, the realist movement expresses a similar idea. Popular from around 1865 to 1900, realism challenged readers to look past myths, assumptions, social norms, and other expectations in order to see the world as it really is. To depict the world in this way, realist writers turned away from grandiose subject matter and instead focused on the lower and middle classes, depicting daily life in gritty and sometimes unpleasant detail. The assumption behind this strategy was that literature had the power to change society, and that by depicting life, warts and all, writers could improve the world without being too preachy about it. Historically, this effort to depict the world in honest, objective terms found its roots in the invention of photography and the proliferation of newspapers throughout the United States. Whereas painting made it fairly easy to romanticize subjects like war, photography offered stark depictions of its subject matter. And as the number of newspapers in America grew from around 700 in 1830 to over 5,000 in 1870, writers like Mark Twain and William Dean Howells adapted the tenets of journalism to fiction. Yet while Howells offered a fairly straightforward definition of the movement, by noting that realism is nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of material, not all realists agreed on the best way to treat material truthfully. Authors like Mark Twain tended to practice a brand of realism known as regionalism. In The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, for example, Twain uses dialect and the local flavor of the American West to highlight social and cultural differences between the story's narrator and the rambling Simon Wheeler. By way of contrast, authors like Charlotte Perkins Gilman found truth and reality in the thoughts and emotions of their characters. This trend is especially evident in The Yellow Wallpaper, which traces a young mother's descent into madness as she struggles with what today's readers might recognize as postpartum depression. Ultimately, however, what all realist authors had in common was an interest in truth and a belief that by honestly depicting the gritty details of everyday life, good writing could change the world.
Naturalism as a literary movement. We've already seen realism and romanticism. We will start with naturalism as a movement. We will define naturalism. We are going to give some information about naturalism. Then we are going to talk about the characteristics of naturalism. I personally picked 7 characteristics, and I think that they are more than enough. But if you want to satisfy your curiosity, you can also find other information, of course. Then after that, we are going to talk about the difference between naturalism and realism. We are going to compare them, because they mostly look the same, but there is a specific difference between the two. Then, at the end, we are going to round off with 3 writers of that movement. We're going to talk about some of their works, and also maybe if you want to search for those works or to read those books of that movement, that would be recommended, of course. Now, without any further ado, we shall start with naturalism. As a definition, we can say that It is a literary genre that started as a movement in the late 19th century, of course, in literature, film, theater, and art in general. It is sometimes, or most of the times, seen as an extreme realism. We are going to know why, because it shows how families, social conditions, and environment affect human character in shaping their personality. You see, naturalistic writers mostly write about how environment determines and governs human characters. You see the word determines? We say naturalism is realism, but with determinism or with a deterministic point of view. This is the difference between the two. The major difference, but we are going to see the other differences, of course. And of course, in this movement, some scientific works and principles are found within naturalism or this movement. Like Darwin, for example, Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest. We are going to talk about it later on. So this is, let's say, a small amount of information. I mean, the basics. Let's say the most important things that you need to know about naturalism as a movement. And of course, we are going to move to the characteristics of this movement. The first one is objectivity and almost a scientific presentation of a situation. You see, there is no judgment of situations, there is no judgment of characters, there is only recording. They just depict things from reality and they talk about them. This is why it looks like realism, because even realism depicts things from the real life or real situation. But in this case, it is for the readers to form their own conclusions and opinions. So in naturalism, it shows, let's say, the hard life and how people live that kind of life, and also they do not talk about let's say personal opinions, because they opted to a scientific presentation. It's just being objective. This is for a specific purpose, that is the readers. It is up for the readers to form their own conclusions and opinions in general. The second characteristic that we can mention is the absence of the free will, of course, of the characters. You see, characters do not have choices in controlling their fate or lives. I mean, their lives are usually governed by social, economic, emotional, sometimes hereditary, or most of the times environmental forces. So in the let's say naturalistic works, or according to naturalistic writers, when they write about characters, they do not give them the free will, or they do not show you that these characters have a choice. I mean, everything they do, it is determined by external forces, such as let's say social force, economic force, emotional force, hereditary force, and environmental force. So this is about the absence of the free will. And of course, the third characteristic that we can mention is the fact that it looks like Darwin's The Survival of the Fittest, like I said. We can take this as a characteristic because most of the times, let's say the picture we get from the works of naturalistic writers, it's the fact that life is full of obstacles, and you will find a lot of people that are struggling with life, and of course the strong survive and thrive and they develop and all, and the weak, of course, become victims and disappear, metaphorically. Now, the fourth characteristic we get is the human instinct is found widely in the characters. I'll explain. Characters are always struggling, like I said, and they are always, or most of the times, in critical situations, or if you want, desperate situations. So in order to survive, in order to overcome the obstacle, they use their basic human instincts. You see, when you are in trouble, your human instinct tells you to do this and that in order to get away or to survive. So in naturalistic works, or according to naturalistic writers as usual, they introduce this human instinct almost in every character they write about. So this is as far as human instinct is concerned. The fifth characteristic is the fact that life is monotonous, of course, for the characters. You see, why do they use the word monotonous? And by the way, monotonous means it's like to have something every day, it doesn't change. The writers do so in order to show the boring and tedious daily existence of the characters, and also to make life in hard surroundings, to show you that life is not all about sunshine and rainbows. I mean, life is very hard. This is as far as life is concerned. And of course, there is something that is what we call one fatal flaw. So it's generally a major mistake that a character does, and this mistake affects the character's decisions during the whole story. And generally, it leads to some bad consequences, such as troubles in general and sometimes even death. The last characteristic that we can mention is the controlling forces. I mean, these external forces that we talk about in naturalistic works are society and the surrounding environment, family situations, and sometimes hereditary things. So these determine the let's say the life of the characters. This is why it is different from realism. Realism says that a decision of a character is their response to a certain situation, but naturalism says that a person's actions are determined by some external factors, which I've already said. It means they oblige them to act in a specific way. Of course, this can be seen again in the last point that we are going to discuss right now. So you have naturalism versus realism. We are going to give three major differences. Naturalism uses scientific techniques to depict human beings objectively. I insist on the word objectively, whereas realism focuses on literary techniques. For realistic point of view, in realism, they use literary techniques. So somehow it is, let's say, a little bit more enhanced. The second difference is naturalism portrays it with a deterministic point of view, while realism depicts things as they appear. So deterministic, it means there is something that determines something else to happen or to act in such way. But for realism, it depicts things as they appear. Do not say that there's something that obliges this to act this way, that way. The last thing that I've already said is the fact that naturalism says that a person's actions are determined by some external factors, obliging them to act in such way. And of course, realism, on the other hand, says that a decision of a character is the response to a certain situation. Now, these are, let's say, we've discussed, so far, naturalism. What is naturalism? What is the definition of naturalism? We've given some information concerning naturalism. We have given characteristics of naturalism, let's say major characteristics, of course. And we talked about the difference between naturalism and realism. Now we are going to move to some of the let's say the writers of that movement. We will start with Émile Zola. Émile Zola is considered to be the big daddy of naturalism, if you want. He's the guy who kick-started the movement in the 1860s in France by attempting to write a new kind of novel. Zola was heavily influenced by Darwin's scientific ideas. Of course, this led to become interested, or this, he became interested in the way that environment shapes people. And some of his works are Thérèse Raquin in 1867 and Nana in 1880. Then we have the second writer is Theodore Dreiser. I do not know if I pronounced the word correctly. Theodore Dreiser gives us a double dose of naturalism, if you want. The American style. Given his tone and subject matter, Dreiser started off his career as a journalist before turning to writing fiction. One of the big themes in his fiction is ambition. His novels often depict characters who come from poor backgrounds who want to escape their poverty and social marginalization. Some of his works, we have Sister Carrie in the 1900s, 1900s, and we have An American Tragedy in 1925. Then we have the last one is Frank Norris. Frank Norris was an American writer from Chicago. He spent some time in Paris as a young man, where he read Émile Zola as well. See, Émile Zola influenced him, as well as Darwin's theories on evolution. Norris was one of the writers who brought naturalism to America. Like other naturalists, of course, he was interested in the way that environment shapes character, specifically within the American context. One of his works, we have McTeague in 1899 and The Octopus, a story of California in 1901.
Mark Twain was born as Samuel Langhorne Clemens on November 30th, 1835, in the small town of Florida, Missouri, shortly after the appearance of Halley's Comet. He became famous primarily as a writer and humorist, but was also known for being a publisher, lecturer, and even as a businessman and investor. Twain was raised in Hannibal, Missouri, which was also the setting for two of his novels, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. After quitting school at the age of 11, he went to work as a printer's apprentice for his brother Orion's newspaper, the Hannibal Journal. He later became a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi River, gaining his license in 1857. As a matter of fact, his pen name originated from his work on the river. The pilot would call out, "Mark Twain," to confirm the water was 2 fathoms, or about 12 feet deep. Twain's younger brother was killed when a riverboat boiler exploded. He blamed himself for not warning his brother after dreaming about such an incident just a month prior to the tragedy, which sparked his lifelong interest in spiritualism. Eventually, Twain followed Orion to Nevada, where he found work as a miner and as a journalist. He first tasted literary success when his short story, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, was published in 1865. After publishing some works based on his life on the Mississippi River, Twain's fame skyrocketed with the success of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He based the main character on his own life as a boy growing up in Hannibal, incorporating some of the mischief and adventures of his youth, such as tricking friends to do his chores for him. It was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, though, that cemented him as a great author. Many critics called it the first great American novel. Twain's fame and endearing, witty demeanor brought him popularity and friendships with politicians, industrialists, presidents, and even European royalty. One of his closest friendships was with the brilliant inventor Nikola Tesla. He loved visiting and socializing with the genius as he worked in his lab. It is often said that behind every great man is a great woman. This was certainly the case with Mark Twain. He shared a great romance with his wife Olivia, née Langdon, who actively helped her husband with the editing of his books, articles, and lectures. Mark Twain became very rich from his writing and lecture tours, but his failures as a businessman and investor led him to bankruptcy. Fortunately, with the assistance of Standard Oil's Henry Huddleston Rogers and a lucrative European speaking tour, Twain was able to pay back all his creditors in full, even though he was not required to do so through his bankruptcy. Mark Twain was a great believer in animal rights and held a special fondness for cats, owning up to 19 of them at a time. Twain predicted that he would die with the return of Halley's Comet, saying, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it." Mark Twain passed away on April 21, 1910, at the age of 74.
To read or not to read? This is one of my favorite books because it's full of humor and wit. One of my favorite parts is when Tom uses his art of persuasion to convince his friends to do his chore, which is painting the fence. Reading this book will not only take you to many mischievous adventures, but also remind you of the joys of childhood. Author Samuel Clemens, known by his pen name Mark Twain, was an American writer, humorist, entrepreneur, and publisher. His novels include The Adventure of Tom Sawyer and The Adventure of Huckleberry Finn. Main characters: Tom Sawyer, a mischievous boy with active imagination. Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer's close friend, a social outcast. Becky Thatcher, Tom Sawyer's love interest, sensitive and emotional. Aunt Polly, Tom Sawyer's aunt and guardian. Summary. The story is about a mischievous boy called Tom Sawyer who lives in a small town on the Mississippi River called St. Petersburg in the 1800s. Tom Sawyer must win the heart of his crush, go on mischievous adventures, and face the consequences of witnessing a murder. Theme. The main theme of The Adventure of Tom Sawyer is the joys of childhood, when the world is full of wonders and children are free of the heavy responsibilities of adulthood.
John Steinbeck was one of America's greatest authors. What books did John Steinbeck write? Why were they so popular? Raised in California, John Steinbeck formed an appreciation for the region. In particular, he grew to love California's Salinas Valley, which greatly influenced his writing. As a teenager, Steinbeck made the decision to become a writer and often locked himself in his room to do his writing. In 1919, Steinbeck enrolled at Stanford University, but eventually dropped out in 1925, having never graduated. Steinbeck briefly moved to New York City, where he found work as a newspaper reporter, but the pull of California quickly drew him back home. While working as a caretaker in Lake Tahoe, he wrote his first novel, Cup of Gold, in 1929. Over the next decade, Steinbeck wrote The Pastures of Heaven and To a God Unknown, both of which were poorly received by critics. Steinbeck eventually achieved success with Tortilla Flat in 1935, a humorous novel about life in the Monterey region. The book was very popular, selling more than 26,000 copies in its first year, during the heart of the Great Depression. 2 years later, Steinbeck published Of Mice and Men. This novel tells the story of two migrant ranch workers. Much of the book is based on Steinbeck's own experiences traveling the country as a hobo. Of Mice and Men remains enormously popular and is read in classrooms across the nation. The Grapes of Wrath was published in 1939. The novel relays the tale of a Depression-era Oklahoma family and their struggle to create a new life in California. In many minds, it perfectly captured the mood and discontent of the nation during this difficult time. At one point, The Grapes of Wrath was selling 10,000 copies a week. It also earned Steinbeck a Pulitzer Prize in 1940. Following the success of The Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck served as a war correspondent during World War II. He continued to write for the rest of his life, producing classics such as Cannery Row and East of Eden. He was even awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1962. John Steinbeck died of heart disease on December 20th, 1968. In 1939, John Steinbeck wrote a novel, which would become one of the most controversial books of all time. It would become one of the most celebrated works of American literature. What was this novel? Why was it so controversial? The Grapes of Wrath focuses on the Joad family, poor sharecroppers from Oklahoma who have to leave their home because of the Dust Bowl and other economic hardships associated with the Great Depression. In an effort to change their luck, they set out for California, along with thousands of other Okies. The book was first published on March 14, 1939. By May, it was at the top of the bestsellers list, and by the end of 1939, almost 500,000 copies had been sold. Its price of $2.75 was fairly reasonable at the time, which allowed many people to purchase copies. Even those who had never read a book before were buying it. Bookstores were sold out, and there were waiting lists at libraries that were months long. The book paints an incredibly vivid picture of the hardships endured by the Dust Bowl migrant workers. It also illustrates how the migrants were treated after arriving in California. When people read it, they were shocked by the poverty and homelessness presented in the story. However, not everyone liked what they were reading. There were claims that the book exaggerated the hardships of the Okies. Many declared that it was impossible for such horrible circumstances to exist in the United States of America. Also, citizens of California were displeased with the way Steinbeck portrayed the Californian attitude towards the migrants. The Associated Farmers of California denounced the book as a pack of lies. Some criticized the novel for other reasons. It emphasized cooperative solutions to economic problems instead of individualistic solutions. Because of these themes, many people felt it was pro-socialist or pro-communist. Because of the book's controversial nature, it was banned from many libraries across the country. One group in California called for widespread denouncement against the book before schools open and our boys and girls find such filthy material on the shelves of our public libraries. National radio programs debated the merits of the book, and it was even publicly burned in Buffalo, New York, East St. Louis, Illinois, and in several communities in California. Oklahoma Representative Lyle Boren went as far as denouncing the book in Congress as a vulgar lie. However, much of this uproar died down when Eleanor Roosevelt praised the book and defended Steinbeck. In 1939, The Grapes of Wrath won the Pulitzer Prize for a novel, and the popularity of the book has endured to this day. John Steinbeck's novel has been translated into many different languages, including French, German, and Japanese. The Grapes of Wrath remains banned in many school libraries across the nation. However, it is probably the most discussed and debated American novel of the 20th century and will always be considered one of the classics of American literature.
In the introduction to The Grapes of Wrath, it's the Dust Bowl of the American 1930s, and the land is eroding, leading to fierce dust storms. Tom Joad, the novel's protagonist, has just been released from prison. He hitchhikes home, and as he walks toward his house, he meets a former preacher, Jim Casey. In the rising action, Tom and Casey reach Tom's home only to find it abandoned. Tom learns that while he was locked up, big landowners drove tenant farmers from their land because of disappointing crop yields. This is what happened to his own family, who are now staying at his Uncle John's place. Tom and Casey arrive at Uncle John's farm, greet the core members of the Joad family, and plan to travel west to California, where there's rumored to be plenty of work. The Joads join countless other migrants who are traveling down Highway 66 to California, and Ma ends up taking on the leadership role within the family. After many challenging hardships on the road, the Joads soon arrive at a Hooverville, a makeshift migrant camp, and are stunned by its squalor and abysmal living conditions. When a contractor tries to hire workers from the camp without stating the pay, angered workers, tired of ruthless exploitation, including Tom and Casey, attack the contractor. Casey takes the rap and gets arrested. Tom leaves the Hooverville with his family. The Jodes arrive at a government camp, Weed Patch, where the migrants are allowed to govern themselves. Although the camp's conditions are good and sense of community is strong, Ma tells the Jode men they have to leave the government camp to find work. The Jodes get work picking peaches at a ranch where they're unknowingly busting strikers whose wages have been unfairly cut. A day's wage is barely enough to buy dinner. Tom sneaks out and meets the people who are picketing the ranch. He finds that Jim Casey is leading them. Casey tells Tom about the importance of all working people uniting to fight oppression. In the climax of the novel, the police raid the protesters' camp and Casey is killed. In the heat of the moment, Tom retaliates by killing the policeman who killed Casey and is injured himself. In the following action, the Jodes get work picking cotton, and Tom hides out in the willows to allow his injuries to heal. When Ma brings food to Tom, Tom explains how he's been inspired by Casey while hiding in solitude. He realizes that people working together to fight oppression are stronger. Tom says goodbye to Ma, leaving the Jode family. A rainstorm hits the cotton farm, including the nearby camp where the Jodes are living. And while it rages, Rose of Sharon gives birth to a stillborn infant. The camp floods, forcing the Jodes to evacuate. In the resolution, the destitute remaining members of the Jode family go to a barn for shelter and meet a boy and his starving father. Rose of Sharon breastfeeds the starving man, symbolically forming a community based on helping others in dire circumstances that extends beyond the family. The Jode family and their former preacher companion comprise the central characters in the epic of exploration and exploitation that is, The Grapes of Wrath. Tom Jode is the second oldest son of Ma and Pa Jode, tenant farmers from Oklahoma. He was sent to prison for killing a man in self-defense and has been let out early on parole for good behavior. An outsider who chafes against authority figures, Tom focuses on immediate tasks and gets angry when pushed around. After Jim Casey dies, Tom comes to understand that all people are part of one soul and becomes a man who channels his outrage for the greater good of humankind. Ma Jode is the matriarch of the Jode family. She is a strong, sturdy woman, but also gentle. She stabilizes and unifies the family. Ma acts as the center or heart and soul of her family. And as the Jodes face various hardships, the family threatens to break apart. To counteract this, Ma's role shifts from the backbone of the family to family leader. Pa Jode is married to Ma Jode. A physically strong man who's the breadwinner of the family early on, Pa is the leader of the family. But as the novel develops, Ma takes on this role. Pa doesn't like this change, but he realizes in a way that he's become a broken man, often second-guessing himself. Jim Casey is a former preacher who grew disillusioned and quit preaching. He meets Tom as the younger man walks toward his home in Oklahoma. Casey constantly questions why things are the way they are. Concerned with the plight of the tenant farmers who are being forced off their land, he realizes his new calling is to help them. Thus, he travels with the Jodes to California. He ends up leading a strike against the unfair labor practices of landowners and is killed, but his ideas inspire Tom Jode. Rose of Sharon is the older daughter of Ma and Pa Jode. Her name is a biblical reference to the following verse in Song of Solomon 2, verse 1. I am the Rose of Sharon, the lily of the valleys. Married to Connie and pregnant with his child, at first, Rose of Sharon is seen as an immature young woman. She has romantic notions of what her married life will be like. When Connie abandons Rose of Sharon, she has a rude awakening. At the end of the novel, Rose of Sharon shows powerful, deeply human maturity by offering to breastfeed a starving man. Al Jode is the third son of Pa and Ma Jode. He is a cocky 16-year-old focused mostly on women and cars. Even so, he also feels a responsibility for helping the family. Al looks up to his brother Tom. Throughout the story, Al shows the desire to become an independent man. Uncle John is Pa's brother. Racked by guilt over his wife's death, much of his life is devoted to performing penance for his sin. Uncle John has severe mood swings. He mostly lives his repentant lifestyle, but carnal pressures swell up inside of him until they burst. The land turtle, the bank monster, a dying dog, the grapes of wrath themselves, and the dead infant in an apple box. These are the often heart-wrenching, sometimes hopeful key symbols in the grapes of wrath. The land turtle is a symbol of narrow vision, which enables individuals and businesses to plod ahead on a determined path, one step at a time. Tom and Ma both take the land turtle approach, keeping one foot in front of the other and focused on immediate needs, which enables them to persevere as leaders against hardship. For Tom, though, this attitude is limiting because it prevents him from having a wider vision, like Jim Casey does. Eventually, Tom breaks out of the land turtle approach when he sees people as belonging to one big soul. The bank monster described in Chapter 5 is a symbolic entity that represents the system of the bank and other big businesses, one that needs to make more and more of a profit to survive. All the people who work for the monster, no matter how lofty their positions, are really the slaves of the monster. Large farmers attract more migrants than are necessary for the jobs available in order to keep wages down, keep prices up, and create more profits. The inhuman monster thrives. In Chapter 13, the death of the Jode's dog foreshadows the many tragedies the family will face. Run over on the highway, the dying dog, like the Jode family, has its life hanging in a precarious situation. Tragedies are inevitable, and their dying dog on the highway symbolizes this. The titular grapes of wrath represent the growing anger within the souls of oppressed migrants. This symbol appears at the end of Chapter 25, in which Steinbeck describes how big farmers harvest crops, including fruits such as grapes, in inhumane ways, because the process involves destroying food instead of allowing hungry people to eat it. Steinbeck takes the imagery of grapes and turns it into a symbol for the migrants. As the big farmers harvest grapes to produce wine, a symbolic crop referred to as the grapes of wrath grows within the souls of the hungry people who watch this process. Instead of producing poor quality wine, the grapes of wrath are growing heavy for the vintage. Steinbeck got the phrase grapes of wrath from a verse in the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which reads, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored." Chapter 30 uses the dead infant in an apple box as a symbol that refers to the biblical story of the infant Moses being cast off in a papyrus basket in a river. In the Bible, the basket connects with Noah's Ark. As Noah's Ark rescued humankind, the Ark of Moses also rescues the people of Israel. In the Grapes of Wrath, Rose of Sharon's stillborn baby in the apple box will show people in town the hardships and horror that the migrants are dealing with as it makes its way along a flooded stream. In the Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck presents three major themes, each consisting of a duality: individual versus community, selfishness versus kindness, and meekness versus wrath. Individual versus community is the most important theme in the novel. Tom Joad embodies individualism. He's an outsider in society, a person just released from prison who focuses on his own business and no one else's. And many other characters are also shown as individuals who do not concern themselves with the problems of others. For instance, in Chapter 5, the tractor driver who plows over the homes of tenant farmers excuses this action by saying, $3 a day, I got a wife and kids, we gotta eat. So for some of these individuals, personal or family necessity drives them to act in ways that hurt others. However, as the hardships of her family and other migrants get worse, Ma sees the need to expand her community beyond her family to the common people. And also, Jim Casey exemplifies the notion of the human community. Casey sees all people as being part of one soul. This relates to the idea of the oversoul, a concept discussed by transcendentalist author Ralph Waldo Emerson that asserts that a universal spirit unites all living things. When people join together for the common good, they have the strength to overcome oppression. Eventually, Tom understands and accepts these ideas and changes from an individualist to a person committed to serving the community. Selfishness versus kindness is a perpetual battle of a theme. The main proponents of a selfish attitude are the landowners and the bank, and their increased desire for increased profits. These entities focus only on getting profits. They do not care how they abuse others. Keeping migrant workers oppressed and weak enhances their selfish goals. However, various examples of kindness take place between common people helping one another out during hard times. The Wilsons and the Jodes help one another and thereby form a small community as they travel together toward California. The waitress that helps the migrant family with food is another example, and Mrs. Wainwright helps Ma deliver Rose of Sharon's baby, even though she has no family ties with the Jodes. Kind people in the government camp encourage an efficient, strong, and caring community. Kindness is the glue that holds the community together. Finally, there's meekness versus wrath. Meek attitudes of the migrants allow landowners and the bank to exploit them. In Oklahoma, owners force tenants off their land, thus creating thousands of people who are unemployed. In California, landowners attract these people to their large farms. By doing this, the landowners create high unemployment, which enables them to have their crops picked for a very low price. The meekness of the migrants allows them to be exploited within this system. Yet migrants can rebel against this system by using their anger or wrath. Steinbeck makes it clear that people need to channel their anger for the common good. Because the migrants are oppressed, wrath builds in their souls. Chapter 25 ends with the line, "In the souls of the people, the grapes of wrath are filling and growing."